Welcome everyone to the Great Minds, Brave Spaces speaker series. My name is Christelle Hales. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm so happy that you are all here. As always, to familiar faces in the crowd, I say thank you and welcome back. To new faces, I'm excited that you've joined us here today. I'm looking forward to seeing you at future events. Today we're going to do something a little different. You know how I go through the announcements of what's to come. Today there are so many announcements that I created a slideshow. So it's going to be really quick so that we can get to the good part as soon as possible. But please stick with me, strap in, get ready. We're going to go real quick through these, okay? The Great Minds, Brave Spaces series, as you know, is off. And for the first time, it is the kickoff event for a series of Black Heritage Month events in our office. In collaboration with the OMA, we're hosting a series of events throughout the month of February to celebrate Black Heritage Month. The next two are in March and April, respectively, as you can see. On March 25th, we are bringing Disha Dyer, who will discuss the importance of perseverance for women in leadership. And on April 16th, we are bringing Todd Green, who will discuss Islamophobia and will look closely at what sort of prejudice it is. What do many well-intentioned individuals and institutions misunderstand about this prejudice? And why might all of this matter for how educational institutions like WPI cultivate efforts to counteract and dismantle Islamophobia, both internally and in the community or society at large. Exciting stuff. We also invite you to join us in celebration for WPI's annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. address on February 13th, 2020 in Alden Memorial from noon to 1. This year's MLK address keynote speaker is Dr. Mark Anthony Neal. Just Mark. I keep on saying Mark Anthony, but it's just Mark. An author and academic from Duke University whose research and career has delved deep into Black popular culture and African American studies. Neal will speak on how Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy impacted Hollywood and continues to influence Black popular culture as we know it. He's going to talk about how MLK influenced everyone from Aretha Franklin to Beyonce Knowles. So it's going to be a great talk. On February 3rd, that same day, later in the evening, Ava DuVernay's 13th film screening and community discussion will be held in Alden Memorial from 5 to 7, right after the MLK Community Dialogue. In this thought-provoking documentary, scholars, activists, and politicians analyze the decriminalization of African Americans and the U.S. prison boom. Refreshments will be provided. We're going to feed you. And there will be a free giveaway for the first 50 attendees. And that giveaway will be a choice between, Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption by Brian Stevenson, and many of you probably already know, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. Two really wonderful books. If you want one of them, make sure you're one of the first attendees. The registration for both the MLK address as well as the 13th is the same registration link. So in all of the emails you get from me that I bombard you with, find one, click that link, and you can definitely register for all those events. Lastly, come join us for lunch and dialogue on race facilitated by our very own Director of Diversity and Inclusion Excellence, Rami Hanna. If you haven't met them already, you're missing out and should definitely get on that. Super clever, super intelligent, and compassionate, Rami will pose a series of questions on culture, identity, lived experiences, and perspectives. This won't be like any conversation on race you've ever had. And lastly, promise, look out for a survey that we'll be sending to you, myself will be sending to you after this. That's what the sign-in is for. Side note, if you haven't signed in, which I had a lot of people just come in for expediency, make sure you sign in so you can get this survey. It helps us to communicate that Great Minds, Brave Spaces is doing what it's supposed to be doing and advocates to continue this work because, of course, this work needs dollars and dollars needs reasons, right? So the survey is going to serve to do that. Also, it helps us to connect with you all and figure out what kind of topics and speakers you would like to see in the series, right? Because this isn't just me thinking in my cubicle, what do I want to do next? I want to make sure that everyone here has a say in what themes and topics are presented here today. All right. For the stuff that we already know, this event is being recorded for those who may not be able to be present but still want to engage and participate. If you have any kind of issue with that, please pull me aside and let me know, and we can definitely work that out. We have Great Minds Base Faces during the lunch hour because we understand that everyone is busy. So during the session, if you need to get up and get more food or go to your next destination, which is completely understandable, that's fine. We ask that you just please be a little bit respectful, right? Now, without further ado, I'd like to present our speaker, Michael P. Jeffries. Michael P. Jeffries is the class of 1949 professor in ethics and associate professor and chair of American Studies at Wellesley College. He holds a PhD from Harvard University and is the author of 3 books: Behind the Laughs, Community and Inequality in Comedy, Paint the White House Black, Barack Obama and the Meaning of Race in America, and Thug Life, Race, Gender, and the Meaning of Hip Hop. He has published over 30 essays and works of criticism in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, and the Boston Globe, and is a regular contributor on both television and radio at Boston's public broadcasting station, WGBH. Please join me in giving Michael a WPI welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that warm welcome. Can everyone hear me okay? Right? Good. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here and be part of this series. You guys have some wonderful events coming up, so I'm glad to be able to set the table a little bit. If you haven't ever seen Professor Neal speak, Mark Anthony Neal, I highly, highly recommend him, so make sure not to miss that one. I want to start and do a couple of things in the short time that I have with you today. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about Obama's legacy, and then I'm going to ask you to talk amongst yourselves at the table. And then from there, I'm going to hear what you said to each other and move into how Obama's legacy influences some contemporary black elected officials today and kind of what the political landscape looks like. I think oftentimes when we think about Obama's legacy, we can start with the realm of policy, and we can think about things like passing the stimulus package. That was way back in 2008. That seems like ancient history now, right? Remember the one that sort of rescued the economy? And then we can think about things like the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden, which was another landmark effort from the Obama administration. And we can think about the passage of the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, which resulted in over 20 million more Americans enrolling in health insurance programs. Obama also appointed a larger percentage of women and people of color to the federal judiciary than any president in history. And the Obama administration stopped enforcing the Defense of Marriage Act, which essentially made it possible for states to pass their own same-sex marriage laws without them being invalidated by the federal government. So those are a few of the kind of policy pieces that Obama went forward with during his 8 years in office. And I raise those right at the outset because I think frequently when we think about what his legacy is, those really aren't the first things to come to mind. We often remember Obama for other things, the way that he interacted with his family, the relationship that he had with his wife, or some elements of his personal story. And those are really some of the things that I think made Obama such an inspirational figure. Not so much the policy realm, but the kind of performative realm, the symbolic realm, what he meant and represented for so many people. So the place I want to start is to ask you at your tables to think of a couple of different things with respect to politics. Just 3 topics to discuss. 1, anytime you felt inspired by a politician. 2, anytime you felt a politician was speaking directly to you. And 3, anytime you felt a politician was speaking on your behalf. So a moment you were inspired, a moment you felt that a politician was speaking directly to you, and then a moment where you felt a politician was speaking on your behalf. If you could think about that and talk about it, share with the other folks at your table for about, 3 to 5 minutes, and then I'm going to come back and listen to what you all discussed, and we'll move on from there. Does that sound okay? I'll keep a mental clock. 3 to 5 minutes, okay? Go ahead. Okay. We're gonna come back together as a group now, and I'm not sure I'm gonna have time to hear from every single person, but I do want to get some responses from each table. So maybe I'll just start on this side of the room and sort of move from table to table so we can hear what we said. I'll start with the table immediately in front of me. Does anyone either kind of want to repeat something that was said at the table, or if you felt there was a common string that you were all pulling at when you were answering these questions, any thoughts along those lines? Yeah.
Well, we both had people that were inspired by Barack Obama.
Mm-hmm.
His name was mentioned in the conversation, and we respectfully had different opinions about his accomplishments and whether he was successful or not at our table, which was good to hear different perspectives. And one of the things we talked about there was a challenge for Obama was when he came into the presidency, the economy was at its worst in decades after the bailouts of the banks. And then after the Democrats lost the majority in the House, I think Mitch McConnell's comment came up at the table that he said, I want to do everything I can to make sure we support nothing that he tries to accomplish, which hindered his last 2 years in terms of effectiveness. So we had difference of opinion on whether he was successful or not at our table.
But you did think that he was sort of an inspiring figure, so that was kind of either way, right? Either whether you were successful or not.
I certainly did.
Yeah. So how about this table? Maybe take a stab at one of the other questions. A time when you felt a politician was speaking to you or for you. Any thoughts along those lines? Anyone over here? Yes. You look like you want to.
He spoke to me and for me when he just talked about hope. And that to me resonated, and just, it was wonderful. I even have his poster with hope above my desk, and it continues to inspire me, that the way he spoke to me, the way he spoke to people that I related to and associated with, so everything was related to that. So,
sure. Yeah, that was a huge part of his campaign. And other politicians, of course, have campaigned on hope as well. He wasn't the first one to do it, but he definitely mobilized people in a way that certainly my generation hadn't seen before. What about this table? Any thoughts about being inspired by or spoken to or spoken for by politicians? It could be Obama or not Obama. Someone else, perhaps. Bernie, okay. Does anyone here, would you like to say a little bit more about that?
It was what inspired.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, folks. So for me, Bernie Sanders came out as one of the Democratic nominees, and that I went to one of his rallies, and that was just, it was so overwhelming to actually be there. It was the first rally I had ever gone to, and to feel the energy of the room and to hear what he was saying. Like, he was pushing for radical systemic change, and I may not agree with where he's going at right now, but at that time for me, it really hit the spot. It really inspired. He was pushing a lot for queer rights and rights of those of color, and so that was extremely important to me, still is. He was a great candidate.
Great. That's a great example. Does anyone else want to give an example along those lines where maybe a non-Obama politician was either inspiring, or a moment where you felt like you were being spoken to or spoken for? Yeah.
After 9/11, regardless of how you feel about how things happened afterwards, there was so much fear for our safety, and I felt like George W. Bush spoke directly to me to lead me to feel like I was going to be protected.
Good. That's a great example. That 9/11 speech was, I think we have a different memory of it now from the distance, but at the time, there was a great deal of uncertainty and fear and safety, and I think many people, regardless of political affiliation, felt a sense of calm after hearing Bush speak that maybe they hadn't before, regardless of what transpired afterward. Maybe one more, where you felt like you were being spoken to or for. I'm going to go to the back here. Sorry. I'm sorry. I saw her hand first. I can get you too.
Thank you. So right now, the politician who's inspiring me a lot is Elizabeth Warren. And a couple of things she does. You can see her on the campaign trail, she talks to the little girl. She says, "I'm running for president because that's what girls do." And I love seeing that. And she also has stories about her own struggles, particularly as a working mom, as a law school student, and how the only way she was able to do all that was because her aunt basically came and moved in with her and helped her raise her children. So it's really inspiring to hear how she knows that struggle of being a working mom, and she knows that she was able to do that and get her degree, have her success because she had a support system, while acknowledging that not everybody has that support system. And I think that spoke to me. I don't have children myself, but I was raised by a single mom, and watching her, all the amazing things she did, having a candidate who reminds me of my mom is, I guess, inspiring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. I'll take one more because I breezed right by you all, and this will be the last one we'll do. This table? Okay.
Apparently there's pressure on me to tell my story.
So polite here.
Well, I have food in my mouth. So during Obama's first administration, his first inauguration, he was saying, just sort of welcoming everybody, and then he was naming off all of the different members, religious groups or faith groups. And I'm an atheist, and it's the first time I ever heard a politician say, "and non-believers." And I was astonished at how meaningful it was to me. I never would have anticipated that it was actually important to be included in the conversation.
Yeah, that's a great example. And that's actually the direction that I want to go with sort of thinking about what we just heard. During that acceptance speech in Hyde Park in Chicago, when he mentioned believers and non-believers, he also, should I just put this down? I don't want to have a double. He also was the first person to acknowledge LGBT people in that very same speech. And I think that it's significant that a couple of the comments we heard, one over here, then one in the back, and this most recent one, talk about these meaningful and inspirational moments, not in terms of the moment that a particular policy was passed, but as a moment in which you saw yourself or you heard yourself reflected in the words and the story of the candidate themselves. And I think that for Obama, that's really one of the most important pieces of his legacy, in particular for black people who, at this level of government, had never had a representative talk not only about blackness, but about their family history and about racism in the way that Obama did. So for example, right, Obama tells this kind of story of American exceptionalism and his story as the kind of immigrant story mixed with the kind of quintessential American story. He tells a story about being both multiracial and black, having a father from Kenya and a mother from Kansas, and America being the only nation in which his story is ever possible. In 2008, when he was campaigning and gave the More Perfect Union speech after the Jeremiah Wright controversy, he mentions in that speech that white Americans have to acknowledge that the racism that black folks are telling them about does not just exist in black people's imagination. That seems insignificant and obvious to those of us who live that life every day, but to hear it spoken on a national stage like that and affirmed by someone with the power that Obama had or was campaigning for was extremely significant. I would also add, though, that just as Obama was able to kind of personalize stories of racism and black experiences, he often tempered those stories with admonitions and criticisms of the black community. So, for example, during a Father's Day speech, he kind of talked a little bit about the kind of quote-unquote cycle of black fatherlessness, which is frankly a bit of a pernicious myth. The CDC has released a study a few years ago that showed that black dads are actually more involved with their children's lives when it comes to things like bathing their kids, doing homework with them, and things of eating with their kids, doing things of that nature than are white fathers. But nevertheless, Obama kind of hit on that trope over and over again during his time in office. He also repeatedly suggested things that might make you think that black students don't care about their schooling as much as white students do. He did that during his 2004 DNC speech and also at other times during his office. So his discourse about race, I think, was complex and contradictory. On one hand, he inspired a great deal of pride among black folks who saw themselves represented in the office for the first time, but he always seemed to temper that message with a criticism of black people's experiences in this country that might make his expressions of criticism directed about racism more palatable to white audiences and onlookers that weren't as comfortable with such an affirmation of blackness. And I think that's a really important first part of Obama's legacy for contemporary public officials, which is that they're going to have to balance a kind of racial rhetoric that affirms black pride and black achievement, but also balances it with a sense of palatability to white audiences. I think we've seen Harris and Booker and others struggle with exactly this dynamic throughout their time in public office. Another comment that we heard pertained to the kind of hope and change rhetoric of Obama. And this is another really important point about his candidacy that speaks, I think, to what contemporary black elected officials or black hopefuls are dealing with. Before Obama, so many of the people who dominated, black folks who dominated those elected positions in Washington, were in some way connected to the civil rights movement. And there was a sense that folks like John Lewis and Elijah Cummings, for example, were coming directly out of that movement and were not only located in that generation of folks, but were actually speaking for the people who were marching in the streets and going to nonviolent protests and so on and so forth, doing the advocacy work. They were very much a part of that community. But now, and this started a little bit with the Obama transition, and certainly we see it in folks like Booker and Harris, now we see folks who are more sort of gap bridgers between that civil rights generation and a new contemporary generation of black elected officials, and aren't really speaking for those communities anymore. First, because they're removed generationally from those experiences, and second, because their upbringing is wildly different from the kinds of upbringings of folks like Cummings and John Lewis. Right, so that's why you have folks like Cory Booker saying things like, I may have graduated from Stanford, but I got my PhD on the streets of Newark, which is patently ridiculous, right? Because from Stanford, he actually went to Yale Law School before he went and became an official in New Jersey. And I'm not trying to disparage Booker's record, but the point is that the fact that he has to say something like that is indicative of the kind of bridge building that he feels he has to do to maintain a connection between what he imagines as a broader community of black folk, right, than just the folks who have had similar experiences to him. Harris, too. Now, Harris didn't go to Harvard or Yale, but she went to Howard University, a historically black institution. She then went to law school in California, and she joined the prosecutor's office because she wanted to have a seat at the table and felt that there was a need for more socially aware prosecutors. And from there, she went on to be the top cop of California, as she sort of once called herself. That's not a narrative that fits seamlessly with the civil rights generation of leadership, right? Those experiences don't fit seamlessly there. So there's a set of challenges that this generation of black politicians has to face that's not only rooted in the contemporary politics of the moment, but in the narrative that they have to build about themselves and how they locate themselves within black communities, right? I'm not questioning their blackness. We have to get away from that kind of rhetoric. It's nonsense. But we have to understand that where at one point it was easy for black elected officials to speak for those constituencies, now we're seeing bridge builders and people who are often speaking to black constituencies more than we are when we had that previous era of leadership. Another major factor in our political climate that contemporary elected politicians, contemporary elected officials and hopefuls who are black have to deal with is a resurgence of explicit racism in political campaigning. This is another part of Obama's legacy, one, of course, that he had no sense of control over. Here you can see a sign at an anti-Obama rally that's comparing Obama to a monkey or an ape, which is, of course, an old trope of racism directed against black people and people of the African diaspora. And it's something that we started to see this bile kind of bubble up during Obama's time in office. It's in no small part responsible for the current president's career, right? The kind of birtherism lie that got started around that time. But since Trump has been in office, we've seen an uptick in this kind of language, this kind of dehumanizing language about black people and black politicians by association, right? So if you think about some of the things that the current president has said, comparing Elijah Cummings' district in Baltimore, saying that it was rat-infested, saying that Lewis's district in Atlanta was crime-infested, calling Haiti a shithole country, suggesting that people in Africa live in huts, right? And then implementing a travel ban that really a quarter of the continent of Africa right now is banned from coming to this country because of the recently passed travel ban, right? And comparing Mexicans to rapists and criminals during his campaign, suggesting that the migrant caravan was a form of infestation. This kind of dehumanizing rhetoric around people of color was thought to be, and political scientists study this was thought to be something that wasn't going to be effective in politics post-1980, right? There was a shift in the rhetoric of conservatives in the late 20th century because they recognized, or they felt, that if you wanted to be racist in your campaigns, you had to do it in an implicit and undercover way. And that's the way politics proceeded for about 35 years. There were kind of subtle implications of racism in some of the campaigns that we saw, but they weren't explicit in the kind of dehumanizing way that we've heard more recently. And now we've seen, not only from the White House, but also in some of the midterm elections, there were incidents in New York State and in New Jersey, where an Asian American person was running for Congress, of more explicit campaigns where racist messaging was no longer undercover, but bubbling up to the top of the surface of these campaign contests. And the reason that's important, right, is because these elected officials now have to figure out what the best way to deal with that form of racism actually is. Of course, they're going to dismiss it, but when Obama was running, he wasn't really worried about that kind of explicit racism as a part of the opponent's campaign. This isn't the kind of thing that McCain was saying. This isn't the kind of thing that Romney was saying when he was running against Obama. But contemporary elected officials who are black have to deal with those questions more directly. Another feature, and then I'll kind of stop here and we can maybe open it up for some Q&A with the last few minutes that we have together. Another feature of the Obama campaign is that Obama was such an inspirational and significant figure that he came to be viewed, I would argue, as like the primary channel or the primary activity of politics, electoral politics. Right? The Obama campaign and what that represented, his time in the White House and what that represented. Electoral politics, in many ways, has come to stand in for, replace, or cloud out all the other kinds of politics that we as citizens, and black folks in particular, have to be involved in if we want our democracy to function. So now we've got a situation where black elected officials have to do a couple of different things, right? Number one, they have to try to generate the same kind of enthusiasm around their campaign as Obama did. And as Harris and Booker learned, that's no easy feat to try to rebuild the Obama coalition. That's what Harris explicitly said on the campaign she was trying to do and failed miserably, right? So they've got to manage those electoral demands. But I would argue they've also got to reinvigorate a kind of participatory spirit that sees democratic action as more than just voting. And the reason that's so important is voting is fundamentally an individual act. You go into the booth alone, you fill out the circle alone, you leave alone, right? But some of the most important forms of participation, whether it's public assembly and nonviolent protest, whether it's going to a town hall and engaging in conversation with your elected officials, those are collective and social acts of democracy. And that's really the spirit of democracy itself, not a kind of individual responsibility for my own vote, but a commitment to engaging, oftentimes in public, with my neighbors in the democratic process. So we should be thinking then about the kinds of politicians who understand how important those complementary features of democracy are. The electoral piece, for sure, but also the collective piece, right? Another reason the electoral piece is an important feature of our current, of Obama's legacy in our current situation is that the Voting Rights Act is under attack, right? So in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that they no longer had to enforce Sections 4 and 5, which meant that states could change their voting laws without oversight from the federal government. And you saw a wave of changes before the 2016 election that resulted in decreased votes in states like Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio has since purged people off the voter rolls, etc. That attack on the Voting Rights Act has not stopped. There's a case right now in the Fifth Circuit Court, which is the court right below the Supreme Court, Thomas versus Bryant in Mississippi, which addresses Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That's different from Section 4. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is the section of the Voting Rights Act that deals with gerrymandering and all kinds of tests and qualifications for voting, poll tax, ID checks, things of that nature. If that case makes it up to the Supreme Court, the same court that gutted Section 4 and 5 is going to be ruling on Section 2, which would open the door for a wave of new wild voting requirements and laws across the country. Some elected officials have made this essential issue of their political career or political profile. Stacey Abrams in particular, right? The should have been governor of Georgia. who has since dedicated her time in the public spotlight to addressing issues of voting access. But this is a new thing, right, that folks like Booker, Harris, Hakeem Jeffries, Ayanna Pressley, and others are going to have to contend with if they want to be national players, right, the limitations on voting rights. So those are a few of the ways I think Obama's legacy has shaped contemporary politics for black politicians. What I would ask now is that if you have kind of questions or comments or wanted to revisit maybe the first set of conversations that we had about inspiration or speaking to you or for you, this might be a good time to take maybe the last 10 minutes and we could talk as a group. So if you want to talk about the state of black electoral politics or being inspired, spoken to, or spoken for by politicians, I'd be very happy to kind of facilitate and engage in that conversation with you. Sound good? Yes? Okay. Anyone else? Anyone want to continue the conversation that we started before or ask questions about what contemporary electoral politics might look like for black folks or other people of color? Yeah, there's a mic right here.
So I'm curious to hear maybe your take on the current Democratic nominees that we have and the large focus on whether or not they're winning over these communities of color in order to propel their campaigns, and maybe how that was connected to the legacy that Obama left behind.
Yeah, that's a great question. Did everyone hear the question? Yeah, so the question was about whether or not our current slate of candidates is winning over the communities of color that Obama was able to mobilize. I mean, I think so. So the first thing the first way we can measure this in a responsible way is to look at things like turnout. Right, so one of the stories of the 2016 election was that black turnout was down and overall voter turnout was down in the 2016 presidential election. And if you're looking at the numbers from Iowa last night, Iowa not necessarily representative of the whole country, turnout was about at 2016 levels, not at 2012 levels. So thus far, we have no evidence that these communities have been inspired back to the levels that Obama did, right? I think that, let me say sort of one thing and then maybe another thing. One group that we haven't spoken a lot about in the limited time that we've had is Hispanic voters. Castro, for example, right, was as a candidate who many people thought would inspire Hispanic voters to come to the polls and support him because of his background, but that didn't quite play out in ways that allowed him to keep going in the race. I think if we look at Hispanic voters, historically they've been voting Democrat over the past few cycles. But if you look at the issues that are most important to them, I think everyone who isn't really embedded in those communities assumes it's all about immigration, right? Because immigration is the issue that the greater public most often associates with the Hispanic experience. But if you look at the issues that actually matter most, that Hispanic voters say actually matter most to them, healthcare and employment are just as important, if not more important, than immigration. So the reason I tell this sort of story about what the Hispanic electorate cares about is I think it speaks to what kinds of appeals anyone who's interested in appealing to voters of color should be thinking about. Certainly, there's some value in having a symbolic appeal and a representative appeal and a family story or a personal history that allows voters to see themselves in the candidate. But if you're not actually committed to addressing the issues, education, healthcare, employment, that these communities care about, it's not going to matter. So rather than doing a kind of show of affiliation with these groups by picking a VP candidate who looks like them or by speaking Spanish during one of your campaign rallies, you need to present policies that these folks actually care about or are going to get behind. I think that's maybe the best way to answer the question. Other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead. So with respect to Biden, yeah, the question was whether Biden's appeal to underrepresented communities was or is strictly because of his affiliation with Obama, or what was it? What was the other part of it? Or for some other reason. Okay. So that's a tricky question. I think the conventional logic to this point, right, is that, first of all, when we say underrepresented communities, we need to be able to disaggregate that. I can't actually speak to what his level of support is with Asian voters or with Hispanic voters. I can speak a little bit to what his appeal is to black voters based on history and what we know about the black electorate. So 2 things. Number 1, the hypermajority that Obama got and his affiliation with Biden absolutely is responsible for the assumption, and thus far truth, that Biden enjoys a wide array of support among black voters. So Biden has said that Iowa and New Hampshire aren't really that important to him because when he gets to South Carolina, the black vote is going to lift his campaign up and he's going to kind of roll from there. However, the thing that we also know about black voters is that we are a practical voting bloc. And what I mean by that is black voters will often kind of take the temperature of the water and vote for the candidate that they think is most likely to win, more so than the average voter, right? This is what political scientists have told us, right? Black practicality in voting is a real thing. It's not just about affiliation or whatever. So the reason I raise that point is if 6 months ago Biden was the presumptive nominee for the party, that's kind of what it looked like the smart and practical choice was. So there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of black support for Biden because of that dynamic. We think he's the most likely to win, and he's affiliated with Obama, so no one's going to question the idea that that's who black folks are going to go for. However, now that it doesn't look like he's clearly the most likely person to win, I think we should be able to question more seriously this assumption that he's just going to get the same hypermajority or even a majority at all by the time he gets to South Carolina. I think he's on much shakier ground, not because his affiliation with Obama has changed, but because the likelihood of him actually capturing the nomination at the end has changed, and black voters are responsive and practical to those facts. Does that somewhat answer your question? I don't know how much time we have left, Christelle. Maybe 5 more minutes? Great. A couple more questions? Yes. Yeah.
What do you think with the...
Here you go.
Kamala Harris didn't seem to get as many black voters to support her as she had hoped. And what do you think are the factors in that? Do you think her role as a prosecutor was the primary factor or other factors?
The question was about Harris and her inability to appeal to black voters, or to really capture the majority of black voters. I don't want to say she didn't appeal to any. A few things. So first, Harris, if you look at Harris's electoral history in California, she's won by very thin margins each time she's won. She was never someone who was just sweeping over her competition in some of these local races in California. And she was drawing on a broad coalition of voters during her time there. It wasn't as if each time she won, it was a black hypermajority that was lifting her up to the office. So she's never really been a kind of politician who mobilized overwhelming support from the black electorate, and that was what was responsible for her winning. She was a coalition builder. And I don't think, to answer your question more directly, I don't think it was simply her status as a prosecutor, but her record as a prosecutor and the things she said and did as a prosecutor, I think were serious issues. It wasn't the fact that she was a prosecutor. It was the fact that when she was a prosecutor, she she said and did all sorts of things that were inappropriate if we're thinking about having a decent criminal justice system, right? Things like penalizing kids and their parents for truancy in school. You can't do that, right? And the way that she talked about having a kind of tough on crime position, this is not unique to Harris. Many black politicians, because crime is often a code word, right? A racialized and racist kind of discourse, a code. And when we say Atlanta is crime infested, what Trump is really doing is suggesting that there's something criminal about black people, right? So in order to push back against that kind of racial coding, many black politicians have to appear tougher on crime than their white counterparts. And I think Harris played that game to some extent by her affiliation and the way she talked about herself as the top cop. But it wasn't just about her landing in the office. It was about what she did and said when she was there. That's my personal opinion. One more, yeah? Great question. Everyone hear the question is about the role of social media today? So one of the reasons that's a great question is one of the things I failed to answer to mention is that Obama was really the first person to weaponize digital I don't mean weaponize in a malicious way, to activate digital campaigning in the way that he did. But the genius of mybarackobama.com and his resulting social media presence was that he brought people online to come into contact with his campaign. And once they got in that online space, what the online space was helping them do was take information from the web and use it in grassroots politics off the web. Okay? That's a really important explanatory piece of why his ground game was so successful, in particular in 2008. And by the time he got 2012, his machine was so strong, he was able to downplay some of that and still win again. But in 2008, without that particular relationship between taking what's online and moving it offline, he would not have won. Since then, of course, everyone has tried to copy this model in all kinds of ways, right? They've tried, they've tried to kind of take that model of putting things online and transferring it into the field. So there's no real advantage for the next wave of politicians to be had in that way. Social media is a little bit different from just the website, right? Because what social media does is it breaks down barriers between celebrities and public figures and their audiences. It allows us to feel a kind of personal connection. When Kamala Harris is posting things on Instagram, she's like cooking with Mindy Kaling in her kitchen, right? This kind of thing was unthinkable 20 years ago, but it's the kind of thing that's really expected now. And for that reason, because it's expected, and because it's been flooded with so much disinformation, and because the gatekeepers in social media have been so unwilling, right, to do things like fact check and limit the spread of false information, limit forms of harassment online, it's become a space that it's not clear to me anybody really knows how to gain a legitimate advantage there anymore. It may be that I think it's absolutely necessary for campaigning, but if you're asking me whether Warren is using social media better than Buttigieg is using social media, I don't really have a great answer for that question. Good questions. Are we up? I think that's all the time we have today, guys. Thank you for your participation. Thank you.